Brooklyn, New York, early 1980. Henry Hill had spent nearly 2 decades earning money for the Lucchese crime family. Hijacked trucks, airport cargo theft at JFK, gambling rooms, and loan-sharking pipelines moved millions through Brooklyn and Queens, and associates like Hill kept the system running. He could never be a made man. His father was Irish, but he knew the drivers, warehouse workers, and buyers who moved stolen goods into the city's markets. At home, his wife Sandy kept life steady and quiet. Then cocaine entered the business. Federal agents followed the money, and the protection Hill trusted began to disappear. If you value real crime history over the movie version, subscribe. These stories come from the records. The associate economy, Henry Hill's place inside the Lucchese family. In the New York Mafia, authority belonged to made men, but much of the money came from associates who could never join the family. Henry Hill was one of them. Born in Brooklyn in 1943, he grew up around the Lucchese crime family and began working for local crews as a teenager. Because his father was Irish, Mafia rules meant he could never be formally inducted. Hill operated as an associate, positioned outside the official hierarchy, but deeply involved in its business. Associates handled the practical work that kept the organization profitable. They arranged drivers, moved stolen goods, and connected buyers willing to purchase merchandise that had quietly disappeared from trucks and warehouses. Hill proved useful because he understood the network of people behind these operations. Drivers, warehouse workers, and small businesses ready to move discounted goods. Men like Paul Vario controlled crews and territory, but associates like Hill kept money moving. The system worked simply. Associates took the operational risks while leadership collected a share of the profits. For Hill, the rewards were quick cash and protection. But that protection had limits. An associate could earn respect, yet the moment he became a liability, the organization could turn on him just as quickly. The airport pipeline, cargo theft, and the JFK economy. By the late 1960s, one of the most profitable criminal operations connected to the Lucchese crime family revolved around a place most travelers rarely noticed: cargo terminals at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. Every day, international flights delivered shipments of electronics, clothing, liquor, and luxury goods. The scale of global freight meant thousands of packages moved through warehouses with tight schedules and limited inspection. Inside that system, organized crime found opportunity. Crews linked to the Lucchese family developed relationships with airport workers who could quietly provide information about valuable shipments. Security routines were studied carefully. When the timing was right, trucks carrying expensive cargo would disappear for just long enough to unload their contents before returning to the road. Henry Hill became deeply involved in this network through the crew of Paul Vario in Brooklyn. Stolen goods moved quickly into legitimate markets through small wholesalers and storefronts willing to buy merchandise at heavy discounts. The system was efficient because it blended illegal activity with ordinary commerce. The scale of the airport theft economy became widely known after the 1978 Lufthansa robbery at JFK, one of the largest cash robberies in American history. Contemporary reporting from history documents how criminals connected to the Lucchese network stole more than $5 million from the Lufthansa cargo building at the airport. Operations like these defined the environment where Hill built his reputation. An underground logistics network moving stolen goods through one of the busiest airports in the world. Sandy Hill. The domestic infrastructure of organized crime. Behind many organized crime operations was a quieter structure that rarely appeared in police reports or court records. It existed inside homes and family routines. Sandra Hill, known as Sandy, lived within that world. Sandy married Henry Hill in 1965, when he was already involved with the Lucchese family's activities in Brooklyn and Queens. The money entering their home did not come from paychecks. It arrived in envelopes and bundles of cash, and managing it required caution. Bills had to be paid carefully, and spending had to avoid drawing attention. In many Mafia households, wives quietly supported the financial side of the operation. They stored money, handled expenses, and helped maintain the appearance of an ordinary life. Sandy followed that pattern. While Henry worked through hijackings, gambling operations, and other rackets, the household still had to look normal from the outside. For years, the arrangement held together. Hill's earnings kept the family comfortable, and their life appeared stable. But that stability depended on one fragile condition. The criminal system producing the money had to keep working. The cocaine pivot, late 1970s expansion into narcotic, By the late 1970s, the criminal economy that had sustained Henry Hill for years began to change. Traditional mafia rackets, cargo theft, loan sharking, and gambling still generated steady income. But cocaine was becoming far more profitable, and many associates were drawn to the expanding drug market. For decades, Mafia leadership had discouraged narcotics trafficking. Drug investigations attracted federal agents, long prison sentences, and extensive surveillance. The risks were far greater than those tied to most traditional rackets. Still, the potential profits were difficult to ignore. Hill entered the cocaine trade through connections that extended beyond New York. One of his key routes ran between Brooklyn and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where shipments were organized and distributed through a network of couriers and small dealers. Compared with stolen cargo, cocaine produced faster and larger returns, but it also brought federal attention. Narcotics cases often relied on informants, wiretaps, and long-term investigations that could expose entire networks. Within the Lucchese family, Hill's growing involvement created quiet concern. Some tolerated the money, while others feared the attention drug trafficking could bring. For Hill, the decision seemed practical at the time. Yet the same business that increased his earnings also placed him in the most heavily policed corner of organized crime. If you're interested in the real history behind these stories, consider subscribing. The risk to the organization. Narcotics and mafia discipline. For many leaders inside the American mafia, narcotics had long been considered a dangerous business. The profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Drug investigations attracted federal agents, wiretaps, and long prison sentences that often pushed suspects to cooperate with authorities. Within the Lucchese crime family, discipline depended on controlling that risk. Traditional rackets, cargo theft, gambling, and loan sharking generated steady income without drawing the same level of federal attention. They also allowed relationships with local officials, unions, and law enforcement contacts to remain relatively stable. Narcotics threatened that balance. If a drug investigation exposed one crew, it could lead investigators deeper into the organization. Wiretaps could capture conversations, and informants could reveal connections between associates and higher-ranking members. Henry Hill's growing cocaine operation created exactly that concern. His network stretched beyond New York and involved multiple partners and couriers. The more people involved, the greater the chance that someone would talk. Inside the mafia, discipline often existed to protect the organization itself. When a member's actions created too much risk, warnings or harsher consequences could follow. By the late 1970s, cocaine had become central to Hill's income. Yet the same business bringing him profit was quietly placing him outside the protection the mafia usually offered its own. January 1980. The arrest that changed everything. In early 1980, the criminal system that had protected Henry Hill for years began to collapse. Law enforcement arrested Hill in New York on charges connected to cocaine trafficking. Unlike the cargo theft cases that had defined much of his earlier career, narcotics investigations carried far heavier legal consequences. Federal prosecutors had broader authority, stronger investigative tools, and sentencing laws that could send defendants to prison for decades. Hill's drug operation had expanded during the late 1970s, with distribution connections stretching between New York and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The profits were larger than most hijacking jobs, but the attention from federal narcotics agents was far more dangerous. Once investigators moved in, the case quickly became a federal matter. Reports examining Hill's life after the arrest described the turning point clearly. An analysis published by A&E explains that Hill's criminal career effectively collapsed after his 1980 narcotics arrest, when he realized that both prison and retaliation from criminal associates were real possibilities. For someone who had spent decades relying on the protection of organized crime, the situation created a new calculation. Cargo theft, gambling, and loan sharking had always been risky, but they rarely brought the level of federal pressure associated with narcotics cases. Hill now faced a choice between remaining loyal to a system that might abandon him or cooperating with the government that had built the case against him. The decision, cooperation, and the collapse of loyalty. After his arrest in early 1980, Henry Hill was pulled into a world he had long avoided. Federal prosecutors, courtrooms, and negotiations behind closed doors. The cocaine charges carried heavy prison sentences, and investigators were interested in more than the drugs. They wanted the criminal network behind them. Hill understood the pressure these cases created. Federal narcotics prosecutions often relied on informants, and long sentences had already begun weakening the Mafia's code of silence. He also knew his position inside the Lucchese family had limits. Hill was an associate, not a made member. Associates earned money for the organization, but did not receive the same guarantees of protection if trouble came. Prosecutors offered him another option. Cooperation could reduce his sentence in exchange for information about organized crime operations. After discussions with lawyers and federal agents, Hill made his decision. He agreed to provide details about hijacking crews, cargo theft networks, and the structure of the Lucchese family. In doing so, he crossed a line the Mafia had always treated as unforgivable: witness protection. The state turns an insider. Once Henry Hill agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, his role in the case changed immediately. He was no longer only a defendant. He became a key source of information. Prosecutors wanted details that only an insider could provide: how crews were organized, who controlled certain operations, and how stolen goods moved through legitimate businesses. Hill's testimony helped investigators understand the structure of the Lucchese family's operations. Cargo thefts tied to JFK Airport, trucking hijackings, and distribution networks that sold stolen merchandise all became part of the evidence presented in court. To protect witnesses who testified against organized crime groups, the U.S. government relied on the Federal Witness Security Program, commonly known as witness protection. Established in the early 1970s, the program relocated cooperating witnesses and their families, providing new identities and new lives far from the organizations they had exposed. Hill and his family entered that system. Their life in New York neighborhoods, contacts, and routines was replaced by unfamiliar locations and strict secrecy about their past. For federal prosecutors, insider witnesses like Hill became powerful tools. Organized crime had long depended on silence to survive. When someone from inside the system agreed to testify, investigators could finally expose networks that had operated in secrecy for decades. Family fallout. Sandy Hill and the cost of cooperate. When Henry Hill chose to cooperate with federal authorities in 1980, the decision did not affect him alone. It reshaped the lives of everyone connected to him, especially his wife Sandra Hill, known as Sandy. For years, Sandy had lived inside the quiet domestic side of organized crime. She managed the household, handled cash, and maintained the appearance of an ordinary life in Brooklyn while Henry operated in a criminal economy outside their home. Witness protection ended that life overnight. Hill's cooperation made returning to their old neighborhoods impossible. The Lucchese crime family treated informants as enemies, and retaliation against witnesses was always a risk. To prevent that, the federal government relocated Hill and his family under new identities. For Sandy, the transition meant leaving behind friends, relatives, and every familiar part of her world. The lifestyle built on criminal money disappeared, replaced by strict rules about secrecy and movement. Even daily routines changed. They could not openly discuss their past or explain their sudden relocation. The decision that had once seemed like a strategy for survival carried a different cost inside the family. Hill's cooperation had helped dismantle parts of the criminal system he once served, but it also destroyed the life he and Sandy had spent years building. Beyond Goodfellas, the structural truth behind the betrayal, popular culture often frames Henry Hill's story as a simple act of betrayal. Films and books focus on loyalty broken and the Mafia code violated. But the reality behind Hill's decision was more complicated than a personal choice between loyalty and fear. Organized crime in the United States operated as a business system. Associates like Hill generated revenue through theft, gambling, and narcotics distribution. In return, they received protection and access to powerful networks. But that protection had limits, especially when federal law enforcement became involved. By the late 20th century, prosecutors had developed stronger tools against organized crime: wiretaps, informants, and witness protection programs that encouraged insiders to cooperate. These changes placed enormous pressure on individuals caught inside criminal investigations. Facing decades in prison, many began choosing survival over silence. Hill's testimony exposed parts of the Lucchese family's operations, but it also revealed something deeper. Criminal organizations and government power were locked in a long struggle where loyalty rarely survived legal pressure. Stories like Hill's remind us that organized crime is not only about violence or betrayal, it is about systems, economic, political, and legal, colliding with each other. For more real stories behind famous crime films, consider subscribing.